The thing about autocracies and dictators is they're quite brittle. The only way that Ukrainians are going to win is by political factionalism in Moscow, getting the upper hand and there being a coup. The war will never end while Putin's in charge. To my mind, the most interesting thing about the rebellion is 100% large bits of the Russian military stood on the sidelines. There's absolutely no way that they would have been able to drive several hundred kilometers towards Moscow without the Russian military, at the very least, sitting on the sidelines, let alone, I'm sure some of them actually declared for Prigozhin, right? What we do know is that this has seriously weakened Putin.
My guest today is once again Dr. Mike Martin. Mike has appeared on the podcast several times before, and among the many things he's doing in life, he's become one of the go-to voices for insights and analysis of the war in Ukraine. Mike has authored a number of books, amongst which is still one of my favorites on conflict, titled Why We Fight. Mike also recently released a new book titled How to Fight a War, which I'm told is an outstanding read that details why wars are won, and perhaps more importantly, why they are lost. I'm yet to receive my pre-ordered copy, as the book is getting released in Australia on the 1st of July, so in a couple of days. Mike joined me today for an update on the war in Ukraine, especially on the events that transpired in Russia over the past week. Mike, welcome back to the Voice of the War.
Hello, mate. How you doing?
Good to see you again. Okay, well, let's get straight into it, because the audience is very familiar with your background, I suspect. And for those that aren't, I will put links to Mike's previous episodes where you can hear a lot more about him. But Mike, from where you're sitting, what the hell has happened over the past week in Russia, obviously? What is going on?
You basically hit the nail on the head. So the thing about autocracies and dictators is they're quite brittle. They have this impression of strength, and you have a strong man, right? That's what an autocrat is. Putin is a strong man, and they project strength, and it all looks very, very strong. But there's a huge brittleness underneath that. And the brittleness comes from the fact that all power is centralized in that person, rather than, in a democracy, we sort of spread power around, don't we? We have checks and balances and different organs of state and, courts and parliaments and executive, and they all sort of balance each other out. And so it's much less brittle because you've got this interlocking system. But in a place like Russia, all power flows from one person, so it's all very brittle. And the way to think about how Putin runs Russia is, there's two sort of models. One is a kind of a mafia type gangster sort of thing. And we've all watched, I don't know, The Sopranos or whatever. Yeah. And the other way to think about it is a sort of medieval court where you've got a king and all the barons are coming up to them and the king is trying to play the barons off against each other to make sure that no one gets too powerful and can threaten him. And that's kind of what's been happening, really, is that Putin built up Prigozhin and Wagner, partly because they were competent and they were just more efficient and able to get things done in a way that the sclerotic Russian state.
And he could wash his hands off it as well. It wasn't,
right, exactly. And he was sort of happy to tolerate them when they criticized military defense. He was quite happy when there was a bit of a beef going on between military defense, and because that keeps them focused on each other rather than focusing on him. And the war in Ukraine has been a disaster for Putin. It's weakened him massively. It's his project, and it's been an absolute disaster. And so to have lots of different organs of state competing, and it's not just the military and Wagner, it's the Chechens, it's the different intelligence services, it's all of these different organs of state. It's a St. Petersburg gang versus the Moscow gang, whatever. And to have all those in a sort of soup where they're constantly looking at each other going, who's gonna, who's in favor, who's not in favor, that suits Putin because it enables him to stay in power, but it doesn't make for a very efficient state or government, or particularly military. Like, you can't project military force very successfully if your troops in Ukraine are sort of highly factionalized between different competing stovepipes.
And have we seen that? Have we actually seen that kind of division play out?
Oh, for
between
sure.
the troops?
Yeah, for sure. So Wagner they've been largely responsible for taking Bakhmut, right, since the beginning of the year.
It's kind of the only success really that Russia can claim, if you want to call it a success, right?
This year, yes, I suppose so. This year, yeah. I mean, I think last year over the summer they took Severodonetsk. But I mean, is it a success? Because, you know, they focused in on it. It was Putin's goal. Wagner accomplished it, but at huge cost. And it had a number of, you know, the Ukrainians realized that Wagner were trying to take Bakhmut, and they deliberately didn't just give up the town. They, at some cost themselves, but much lower cost than what the Russians incurred. They sort of fought an attritional defense where they retreated very slowly and did as much damage as possible to the Russians. And what that did was that tied the Russian focus up in Bakhmut, which enabled the Ukrainians to build up this counteroffensive force, which we're now seeing start to be deployed, although far from fully deployed at the moment. So I think actually whether... And the Russians now losing Bakhmut, right? Because Wagner's pulled out and the army are holding it, and then they're losing it. The Ukrainians are moving in on the flanks. So was it worth it? Probably not. And the other thing that the Ukrainians did is they realized that there were these divisions between Wagner and the military and so on and so forth. And they deliberately used Bakhmut as a way of exacerbating those divisions. So both in what they were doing on the battlefield, so they would sort of differentially allow, retreats and attacks, depending on who the enemy they were facing was. But also they were playing a kind of an underhand, an intelligent game where they were sowing the seeds of dissent between Wagner and the military. And we know that Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, was talking to the Ukrainians and potentially giving up some Russian military commanders. And so the Ukrainians were playing this very clever intelligence game.
Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm sure, I'm not familiar with it, so I'm sure there'll be other people.
Yeah, check it. So that basically it came out later on, but basically it turned out that Prigozhin had several contacts with the Ukrainian Secret Service. Right.
Okay.
And one of the things that came out was that he was kind of discussing Russian military positions and stuff like that. Now, is that true? Is that not true? I mean, if it's true, fine.
But even so, but it's
a black op. The whole thing is designed to
sow a seed of doubt,
sow dissension, right? And then we see that dissension bubbling out into open rebellion. And so, I think you can see what the Ukrainians did in Bakhmut over the last 6 months as nothing but a complete success. Firstly, because it tied up the Russians. Secondly, because it allowed them to exacerbate this dissent between the two major factions on the Russian military side. And, zoom out a bit. The only way that Ukrainians are going to win the war in Russia is by political factionalism in Moscow, getting the upper hand and there being a coup. The war will never end while Putin's in charge. So therefore, everything the Ukrainians do is about exacerbating factions and trying to bring about political change in Moscow. And so you've got to look at everything they do on the battlefield as being geared towards that goal, because they're never going to kick out every last Russian out of Ukraine. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
And so here the Ukrainian method of victory is at odds with what the West wants. So this is the trap that we see. The West wants Russia to be kicked out of Ukraine, but actually they probably prefer Putin to stay in charge because they don't know what comes next. Right. And what comes next could be much worse. And Russia
and likely would be, right? If Putin goes down, chances are it won't be a Western-leaning, Ukraine-loving.
It definitely won't be, but it might be worse, or even worse than that is Russia splits into several different fiefdoms, and the big problem is the nuclear weapons. That is the major problem: who owns physically the nukes, and then who controls the launch? The ability to launch those nukes. So, in this sense, there's a tension between the way that Ukraine can win and the way that the West wants them to win. Everyone wants Ukraine to win, but it's just the different routes that we go about it. So I think there's a slight tension there.
I'll pick up on that a little bit later. I'm just signposting you now. Everybody wants Ukraine to win, of course. Certainly in our audience, I suspect there will be a large percentage. You and I obviously do, but maybe we'll pick up on that a little bit later on, because I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the kind of strategic picture and the geopolitical games that are being played and who's watching what. But I also want to just pick up on this idea of brittleness, and that it was in Putin's interest to keep Prigozhin, Shoigu, Gerasimov kind of all in this tension.
Yeah,
that to me just seems just insane, given what's happening and the risk that brings. Right. So, are you confident that this is a game that he was playing, or is it just literally all running out of his hands? I mean, is he losing grip on power because these guys are now feeling empowered these guys, when I say these guys, I mean Prigozhin, that he feels empowered, that he can challenge Gerasimov, and Shoigu publicly as he has done for months now?
I don't think you have a choice if you're a dictator, right? You have to some divide and rule. You have to play factions off against each other. It's the only way you're going to stay in power, because if you create a proper hierarchy where you have someone who's in charge of everyone else and they report to you, that person will then inevitably challenge you for your position. To my mind, the most interesting thing about the rebellion is 100% large bits of the Russian military stood on the sidelines. There's absolutely no way that they would have been able to drive several hundred kilometers towards Moscow.
Yeah, it's just bonkers,
without the Russian military, at the very least, sitting on the sidelines, let alone, I'm sure some of them actually declared for Prigozhin, right? And we've seen some clear outs in Rostov, right? Where the Prigozhin, we've seen some people being arrested and whatever. So we know that some people did go over to Prigozhin. And how it seems the Air Force stayed loyal, because we saw some of those attacks. But
although they didn't shoot, there's a bunch of. I just read earlier today that a bunch of pilots are now being investigated for not engaging Wagner and potentially being prosecuted for disobeying a lawful order, which it was, right? In the defense of the state. The state was under threat, so therefore it was a lawful order.
Right, and the defense of Moscow was people digging ditches in roads with diggers. It was not deploying an armored division. Right? Yeah. It was civilians getting out there, and whoever Putin ordered getting out there to dig ditches in the road. It was not. Where is the 37th Guard Division?
I just wonder about this point about Russian soldiers being kind of on the fence. I suspect they probably were confused as hell, because in this environment where everything is in question now, you just don't know who. You've got Russians shooting Russians who were trying to escape, from the front lines, and I'm sure that's seeping in. So the morale of the troops must be just abysmal. Now you've got the best troops, Wagner, turning onto Moscow. I mean, I suspect even if you were supportive of Putin, I suspect it would be difficult to mount a resistance, because holy shit, like if these guys are against us, hold on, something's obviously going on, which is perhaps this confusion of these 24 hours. No one really knows whose side they're on. They're just kind of following the guy that's in charge at the time, which is again, really something we see in these types of authoritarian regimes, or where when people came out in Rostov carrying Wagner flags, that reminded me of images we saw in Kabul of people coming out with Taliban flags, right? Like, it's just kind of like, okay, who's next?
These guys are in charge now. Yeah. It's like preservation, right? Yeah, but when Wagner left, they got cheered, didn't they? So at that point, you'd think that they'd be welcoming the police back. When the police came,
there were actually roadblocks.
When Wagner left, the police were booed, right? So that's not a good sign. I think you've got to look at how coups work, right? And so the main thing about a coup is it's all about momentum. Because what happens is, like you're saying, everyone just looks, everyone goes, coup's happening. And they look around and they go, who's going to win, right? Straight away, it's all about making a judgment of who's going to win and then joining them. Because you don't want to be on the wrong side.
Yeah, that's right. That's just human psychology, right?
That's just human psychology. Yeah. And it seems that where we got to was rather than everyone immediately being loyal to Putin, which is what you'd expect, right? Look, if someone tried to launch a coup in Australia, The Australian army, there's no question that the Australian army wouldn't immediately, spring to.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen in Russia, right? And as we discussed, there's definitely acquiescence, standing by, and clearly what they were doing was going, who's going to win? Who's going to win?
Yeah.
And then we have this
Which
weird
patch am I wearing tomorrow?
Yeah. And Prigozhin then heads off into exile, but that's acting against his own interests. So, what's going on? What was the deal done?
Yeah. What do you make of that? What have you been reading, hearing?
I mean, the only thing I can think about is that, and there are a few sort of rumors. I supposed it, I mused it, and then on Twitter, and then there were some reports that came out the following day that they basically, the Russian FSB got to all the families of the Wagner commanders, and Prigozhin's family, right? That's the easiest way to think mafia boss. That's the easiest way to stop these things dead. But don't know. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. Because why would he give up? Like, he was 200k from Moscow. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I've read various analyses, and one of them that seems the most salient is that he never really wanted to do it. He was forced and pushed, and he didn't really have a planned post. As in, he didn't have a planned post. What's he going to do in the Kremlin?
Prigozhin?
Yeah.
But what's he going to do in the Kremlin? I mean, I don't know.
As in the way I read it was that this was, he wanted attention, Putin's attention, and it kind of all spiraled out of control before he realized, holy shit, I'm actually 200k from. I don't think
humans work from that. Like, he's not stupid. He knows that if he launches an armed rebellion, he's a marked man, and he's got to win. Yeah, if he doesn't win, then he's a marked man for the rest of his life.
So he's
a marked man now.
Yeah, is he a dead man walking? If he's even walking, I mean, we haven't seen much or heard much from him.
Is he dead or is Putin dead? I don't know. I've got no idea. I don't have any special information. Maybe he takes over Belarus. I mean, who knows? Like, it doesn't. None of it makes sense, which means there's a load of information that we don't have. What we do know is that this has seriously weakened Putin. Right? If you're a strong man and you have an armed rebellion on your territory, not to mention the kind of all the stuff going on in Belgorod, all the sort of Russian Freedom Legion or whatever, coming across the border from Ukraine. That's not good. That's not a good look. The war's going badly. The Ukrainians are about to, have some battlefield successes. They haven't even deployed most of their strike force yet. They're already, Wagner have pulled out of Ukraine, right? That's 25,000 of the most competent soldiers. That's a huge hit, right? Bakhmut, there's gains. The Ukrainians have made a crossing over by Kherson, over the Dnipro, like the Tokmak axis, steady progress. Volodar, still steady progress. Like, something's going to give at some point. And the Ukrainians are going to make some big gains. And, it's just, and again, you get these a faction can use this as a narrative to blame Putin and say, we should be in charge and we're going to win the war. And the Americans let's not make any bones about this. Whichever faction can turn up and say, we're in charge of the nukes, the Americans will go to them and say, we'd be delighted to welcome you back into the international system as long as you end the war in Ukraine.
Do you reckon they will do that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, because I think, again, it comes down to controlling the nuclear weapons, right? And not having them dismantled, sold off, whatever, auctioned on the dark web.
Turn up anyway.
And whichever power can say, oh, we've got control of the nukes. This is why basically what we want is a military coup in Russia, right? That's the best of all outcomes, because the Russian military, they're not, they're a pretty run bunch, but they're a lot better than the kind of ultra nationalists in Moscow. And, these are the people who are on TV every day saying we should be nuking Europe and stuff. The Russian military aren't saying that. The Russian military are organized. They cover the entire territory of Moscow, and they're currently in charge of the nuclear weapons. So it strikes me that a military coup is actually the best outcome. And they're also people who are kind of, as we're both military people. you're indoctrinated into bigger things when you join the military, right? In the sense that you take on responsibilities and you think about the state, and that's probably a credible negotiating partner for the US and for China. And it enables them to say, we didn't want to go into this war. We were pushed into it by Putin. We're just following orders. We'll withdraw. You'll restore our position in the international system. We'll guarantee nuclear security. I don't know. That's the kind of grand bargain, right? That I suspect that we're heading for, or I hope that we're heading for, because the other option is Putin, loses power, dies, falls out of a window, whatever, and some crazy nutter takes over.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, just having read over the last 24 hours what's happening, I mean, he's making appearances, I think on national TV, and he's trying to play it off as, he had it under control. He didn't sleep a minute during the uprising or the coup attempt. And now I think he
didn't.
What's that? Yeah, I bet he did. That's right. Yeah. But now I've also read, it was the New York Times that put it out. Surovikin was also apparently arrested. So, the second in command, who apparently...
That was the guy who did the hostage video on the night, right? Was sent out to do it, with an AK on his knee.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what is it? A general.
But look at that. That is not a regime that's in control, right? That is not a regime that's in control. You trot out a general looking disheveled. It's Friday night. They've all been on the piss, right? Yeah. You go to whichever bar that general's in. You give him a set of combat fatigues, and you give him an AK, and you film a hostage video. That is not this is not a great power that's in control of this shit.
Yeah. And he's now under, if true that he's under arrest because he was apparently supporting Prigozhin, and that's because he was also apparently again quite critical of Shoigu and Gerasimov. So there seems to be a purge of Prigozhin and his crew.
But purges make the system less stable and more stable, right? It might shore up the stability of the system in the short term, but purges then build up more enemies.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Which makes it more brittle again.
Makes it more brittle. So it shores it up in the short term. It looks stronger, but it makes it more brittle. So the situation basically accelerates out of control. If you're an autocrat and you've got everything nicely balanced, you've got all of these acolytes playing off against each other, that's great. But gradually you have to purge and punish and whatever. And then gradually it becomes more and more brittle, the system.
Yeah. And especially when all the pressure as well, so it's not just the internal pressure, it's external pressure. It's Ukraine. It's the rest of the world, still probing and undoubtedly, as you said, it's an intelligence game. I have no doubt that, many Western powers have their fingers in that pie as well, in shaping. Yeah,
and we saw China. We saw a Chinese ambassador a couple of days ago say that, well, yes, I think we should look at restoring Ukraine to its 1991 borders. That's pretty massive,
right? Okay, I didn't see that.
That's huge.
Okay, who was that? Sorry, who did you say it was? It was Chinese. What?
It was a Chinese ambassador. You have to Google it. I can't remember.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay. It was obviously, an official. Well, they're just flying a kite, aren't they? They're flying a kite. It's not like a settled policy position. Yeah. He said, I don't see why that shouldn't be the case, is what he said, right? It wasn't like, here's our policy, but it was definitely flying a kite, right? Yeah. So, their everlasting and deep friendship or whatever it was looks pretty shaky.
What did you make of the claim or the offer to the Wagner soldiers to, either return home, go to Belarus, or sign contracts with the army? How many do you suspect would have taken option C?
It wasn't. So go home, maybe. It wasn't signed contracts with the army. It was signed contracts with the military or other security forces.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. That's right. Yes.
And that's the key point, because they're not going to serve in the Russian military because it's hierarchical and inefficient and all the rest of it. Right. And Wagner, one of the reasons Wagner's successful is because they are, have lower
agile and able to move. Yeah.
Agile. Yeah. Mission command type stuff. And so they might go into one of the other paramilitary forces attached to one of the intelligence agencies or whatever, right? I mean, talk about talk about making the system more brittle. So one of the players, obviously, is the FSB and the GRU, right? GRU is fairly close to Wagner anyway. But let's say that lot join one of the paramilitary arms of the FSB or the GRU. Well, then suddenly you've got a bunch of pissed off people who are motivated, but then also working with another faction. Like, it's kind of like rearranging the deck chairs. So will they go to Belarus? I don't know. I mean, this idea of camps in Belarus, that doesn't make sense. Like, none of it makes sense. Why would you allow an armed force to exist on the territory of a neighboring country that's a really quite a weak country? Doesn't make sense.
Lots to look at over the next days and weeks and months ahead. But what are some of the scenarios you think play out? So give me your most likely and your most dangerous from Ukraine's perspective.
From Ukraine's perspective.
Yeah. Given what we've seen.
I think that, what do I think is the most likely thing to happen? I suspect that we will see not much happen for a little while, a few weeks. And then I suspect Ukraine will suddenly burst through one section of the line and flood in, and there'll be a bit like the Kharkiv moment in September last year.
A mass collapse.
Basically what they're doing like basically recce by force at the moment, right? I mean, battalion level, brigade minus recce by force.
Crazy, the figures, yeah.
And I suspect at some point they'll spot, and because they're smashing all the Russian logistics, at some point a section of that front line is going to collapse. So that I suspect is going to happen. I haven't got a clue what's going to happen with the Wagner tail. It seems to me they're just waiting in the wings, right, to take advantage of stuff that's going on. I think Putin's incredibly brittle, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was some other, this deal has just delayed the inevitable coup, right? So whether that Ukrainian success on the battlefield and the Russian coup are linked, or, it's not really clear in what sequence they'll come in, but, there's a reasonable chance that both of those things will happen before the end of the year. I guess the most dangerous for Ukraine is that they fail to, neither of those two things happen. And next year they're entering into the US
election cycle,
presidential cycle. And then it makes it harder for them to support Ukraine because, if you look at the runners and riders in the US presidential election, not all of them are supporters of Ukraine. So, support to Ukraine might become political football, and the argument will be made that you gave them all this stuff and they haven't done anything. Whereas if the Ukrainians do have some successes, Biden can make the example saying, look, well, we gave relatively small amounts of money compared to the Pentagon's budget, and we degraded the military of a major geopolitical competitor. So, that's a pretty good argument to make going to the polls. Like, is a great value for money argument. With the help of the Ukrainians, we have basically destroyed the military of a major peer competitor. But, it's rocky because what happens, as we discussed earlier, what happens if there's a coup, someone crazy takes over, the control of the nukes falls into one set of hands is bad enough, but what if it falls into several sets of hands? That's the really dangerous, And look, there are safeguards built in and nuclear launch codes and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully there's enough safeguards built. I mean, I'm far from an expert in Russian nuclear security, but hopefully there's enough safeguards built into that system that it doesn't, splinter, fall apart.
Yeah. Although we've been disappointed more than once by the alleged might of the Russian capabilities.
I mean, if their nuclear arsenals are anything like the rest of their military,
it's probably rotting somewhere and very poorly maintained with flat tires. On that note, Mike, before we sign off, tell me a little bit about this book that's in the mail for me in a couple of days. What's the book about?
So How to Fight a War is it does exactly what it says on the tin, right? It's written in the second person. So from me to you, Maz, and it explains to you as the commander in chief what you need to do to fight a war successfully and the major obvious pitfalls that everyone always falls into. Because basically we fight wars all the time, but we're not very good at it. Look at Putin, total failure.
Well, look
all
at
of
us.
the West,
right, yeah,
Afghanistan,
exactly.
Iraq, total failure.
Right.
Like, so we're really bad at fighting wars, but actually it's quite simple in conceptual terms or in kind of how to do it. Obviously the detail is in, actually carrying that out. So, it's split into chapters: strategy, logistics, morale, training, right? Those are your four like foundations. If you get them right, you'll be able to fight a war. And then we have a chapter on land, air, sea and space, information, and then weapons of mass destruction. And then there's a final kind of section where it all gets brought together and it explains how, as a commander in chief, how to fight a war. And it's written to the commander in chief. So hopefully some of the people who are going to fight some wars read it. And the reason we want people to fight successful wars is because they're over quicker and they achieve their geopolitical objectives. If you fight wars that are unsuccessful, you end up just revisiting that war again in a couple of years' time to try and resettle it.
Well, the aim of war should be to achieve a just peace, right? So, and if you can do that quickly,
exactly. But I think what a lot of people, if the Amazon reviews are anything to go by, obviously been out in the UK for a bit longer. It's just coming out in Australia now, and then in America in August, and various other countries are in the pipeline.
Great.
But the Amazon reviews, lots of kind of people who are not interested in military stuff have found it fascinating because they find that they can now watch the news and understand much better what's going on because they've got the kind of context. Like it's written in plain speak rather than dense jargon,
That's
and
great,
it was designed so that people can pick it up and go, I now understand what's going on.
What they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if it's anything like Why We Fight, I can't wait to read it. I'm sure there's another podcast episode on the book with Mike, with Mike von Clausewitz.
We can apply it to Ukraine, right? We could go through the principles and have a look at how the Russians and how the Ukrainians have done.
Great.
In Ukraine.
Sounds great. Well, that'd be great. My book, my copy is in the mail in 2 days from now. So it's very timely. On that note, Mike, it's always a pleasure. Looking great, despite the lack of sleep that I'm sure you're under with all the various things you're doing in your life. But thanks for your time once again, mate. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Maz.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please take a moment to like and review the show wherever you get your pods. Thank you, and until the next time.